So when I first started the painting, the first thing I wanted to do was understand my lighting. What I got from the 3D model was a really good base and block out of the composition, but what wasn't clear was maybe where the light's coming from, where we would kind of get good amounts of contrast, where we would pop out the shapes, and kind of how we're going to show the forms best. So by starting by thinking about lighting, you can already see on this kind of, I call it like a mushroom-like structure, you can see I'm able to define the silhouette of it, as well as kind of you understand the dimensions of what side is facing light, which side is facing the shadow, and that allows me to get some really nice hard and soft edges. And that's the main thing I like to get from when I'm planning my lighting, because soft edges are where form's turning away from the light kind of more subtly, and then when you're looking at a hard edge shadow, that's kind of an object casting a shadow onto ground plane or whatever else that be. So you can see I'm just kind of blocking in all my shadows, getting everything to work. I kind of decided early on that my lighting would be coming in from the top right, and what this allows me to do, because I'm planning ahead, is be able to light the mech and show two faces of it. So what I mean by that is the right side will be facing the light, and the back side and the left side will be facing the shadow. That way we get a really three-dimensional feel from it. If we backlight an object, so for example if the light was coming kind of all the way down from the perspective, then we would just get a silhouette of the mech. It would flatten out severely, and we would just kind of not really get into understanding the three-dimensional nature of how each of these objects are to be designed. Another thing that's nice is I also get some shadows from buildings off to the right. I never really have to resolve what those are. The fact that they're shadows from an object out of the screen, in fact, even makes it feel more like this is just one window of a very lived-in city. From here I want to make sure that all the layers that I'm creating in space are really clear. Luckily from the 3D model I have a clown mask, which is every time you see those flashes of really bright saturated colors, a clown mask allows you to have clear silhouettes of each of the objects. So I can always refer back to that top group where I have my clown mask, and then I can magic wand the object I want, instantly get the silhouette, and start painting from there. And here on the mech you can actually see now the hard and soft edges I just talked about. We have the hard edge cast from the kind of head of the mech, and then we have these softer transition forms, and you can see how that builds the three-dimensionality of the object extremely fast. So I just go through and individually go through each object, making sure that my lighting is feeling correct, that I'm getting the right forms to face the light. I like to start with a large soft brush, which you'll get in my brush set, and then carve into it with some harder brushes so that you get that really nice contrast. It makes it feel really sharp. You start with large soft and then just kind of like sculpt it. If you're thinking about a sculpture, you start with this kind of blobous mound of clay, and then you take your tools, you shear into it, you're refining, you're carving, you're simplifying it down to a really distinct finished form. So through the rendering you'll always see me always starting with the largest idea, the softest idea, and then just refining and refining it until I think it's at a place that doesn't need to be worked anymore. And one thing that's nice about this composition is those mushroom-like structures, they kind of repeat into the distance. I only painted the foreground one, and then I just squished around the proportions for the rest. This allows it to create a lot of space and a lot of understanding of, how deep into this environment we go. Just adding some cast shadows throughout the whole image, making sure I have a good amount of contrast. And while I just added a large shadow to the left side of the image, and that logically doesn't make the most sense, but what I really want to make sure that this piece has is a really strong focal point, which in this case is the last mech standing. It has the brightest whites and the darkest darks, and it draws your eye to it just on a value level. Even if you were to squint your eyes, your eye would just be attracted to those bright whites and those dark darks side by side. So I'll be doing things, and the reason I always do this is because we're designers, we're concept artists, we're not photographers. If I wanted to have a photorealistic environment, it would just kind of be random, it would just be whatever the current day's lighting scenario was. But as a designer, I want to make sure that the way that I'm lighting it is best for this scene. And now I'm getting into color, and the way I approach it in this instance is I always like to try something new. So what I wanted to do was kind of just mass out these large blobs of color almost randomly, rotated until I felt, oh, those kind of actually match up. And that sparks in my brain like all these new ideas of, oh, maybe I want this city to be very sci-fi, not not in a classic way that we see it all desaturated and gray, but I wanted to bring in an element of color that, you know, it's challenging to work with. It's something maybe I haven't seen before and makes me come up with new solutions. That way my process is always fresh, it never stagnates. And here you can see me using some photos. I like to always have each photo I use kind of on a different layer if I can. So one might be color burn, another one is screen, another one is multiply, so on and so forth. Overlay is really great. And I like to do this because it makes each one kind of have a different noise to it. It doesn't make the whole image feel uniform. And again, it doesn't let me get lazy with how I'm using photos. I don't want the photos to control me. I don't want them to decide how my design is. And you'll see it with those two cylinders. At first, I let the photo decide where those kind of light structures were. There's three kind of red, warm, kind of almost like furnace burning inside each of those tubes. And I let the photo decide that they were just evenly spread out on the thirds. And you'll see later into the painting that ended up being a really poor decision. It was flattening the whole composition. It was just making everything more static than it needed to be. So I end up kind of squishing those three that I'm currently painting to the bottom third. That way it felt a lot more dynamic and it was guiding my eye, again, closer to the mech, which is the most important part. So again, you know, just starting to refine, trying to build some noise. I try to be really loose with a lot of my brush strokes because all of this is just going to be painted over as I refine it. So the more that can show through, the more grit and texture will make this feel, again, more illustrative, more like a painting, more artistic and easy to view, rather than stiff and cold like a lot of 3D models or a lot of photos end up looking. So I'm just trying to integrate, again, playing with shadow, making sure that everything is reading the way I want it to, trying to bring in some of the purples that my color left in, and resculpting, again, hard edges over the soft that I initially put in this painting. It was really interesting also working over another artist's 3D model because, you know, some of these forms I wasn't quite sure exactly how they were intended to be, so I got to reinterpret them, got to design them in a way that I felt worked best for the environment. And yeah, I'm just trying to pick up some highlights, get the silhouette really clear right now. Rendering some of the key architecture. If you guys study a lot of paintings, you'll notice that in a lot of them, there's only between 3 and 7 objects that are painted in a high quality way. And the rest of the image kind of falls to the back. And it's almost like when you see a movie, you tell your friends about your favorite part, and maybe a couple of the other details, but you don't tell them about the part where the character opened a door. So similarly in this image, I wanted to focus on the key architecture, make sure it'd be the part where if you were to talk about this painting, you'd say, oh, it's the one with the mech and the mushroom-like structures or umbrellas. And they'd be able to kind of pick up, oh yeah, I see that really clearly from this image. There's distinct objects that your eye is drawn to, and then the rest of it, you can even see I'm starting to build out, push it into the fog, push it into the back. It's less important, it's less demanding, and I don't want the viewer's mind to be clouded with all these different details everywhere. I really want them to take away the message that I'm putting into the painting. So you can see immediately I'm actually rendering these cylinders I was mentioning earlier. They felt wrong in the painting, and I thought that if I rendered it, it might solve the problem. So I'm adding more highlights, adding more shadows, defining it more. But none of those are going to end up being the solution. Really was just almost like a redo. Sometimes you have to murder your sweetheart, the term that I was taught in calling it. So what that means is there's something that you love, something you're putting all this time into, and you're so close to it that you're not seeing how flawed it is and how it would probably just be better if you let it die and start it again from the ashes. So like a phoenix, it will soar later on in this video. You'll see I actually don't spend that much time on the ground plane. That was probably one of the longer segments you'll see of it. Simply because, again, it's not the focus. I just want it to be noise in the background that kind of grounds the viewer's eye. And from here I'm kind of defining a lot of taking the photos I have, seeing what noise it created, picking out what shapes I want to add highlights to and what areas I want to kind of add 45-degree cuts, make it feel a little more futuristic, because the scene right now feels very 3D modeled. It feels very blocky, like a basic mesh. Nothing too complex, nothing that an architect would actually be interested in building. Right now it's just cubes stacked on cubes, and that's something I want to fight going in. So I start adding some cuts. I'm going to start adding some more wreckage, using some photos of airplanes, helicopters, anything to give me noise that I can paint over. You'll see that this actually ends up being the main mech's design. And the way I did it was I took that photo. I was really interested in the back half of the helicopter. And when I add highlights to it, it's going to change the context, make it feel a lot more military. The back of the helicopter ends up being the front of my mech. So, you know, again, I'm not letting these photos control me. I'm not letting them make my decisions. I'm taking what they gave me, what I found interesting about them, and reinterpreting them for my own use. For a second there, I added some highlights that were a little bit too bright. I was zooming out and looking at the painting, squinting my eyes, and my eye was looking at the bottom right corner. And as I mentioned, there's really no reason in this painting why you should be dawdling over there. I'm like a video game. I'm trying to guide the viewer's eye, trying to make sure that they move through the painting in a correct way. And the way I want that way to be is to first see the large mech in the foreground, then kind of see maybe the rest of the cityscape. You're like, wow, this looks a little interesting. And then you see some of these wrecked mechs and you realize that they're in a similar vein of design. So you kind of can start having the clues to put together that there was a story here, that there was a war, something happened, and only one survivor remains. Whether that story be that this is the kind of captain of the platoon and he's looking back at everyone he's lost, or that this is one rogue that took everyone else out, that's kind of left up to the interpretation of the viewer more. But what's essential is that this guy's still kicking and the rest of them aren't. So again, you can see how now the way that the mech is coming along, it's really easy with that lighting. I can drop everything that's facing shadow, pretty dark. I don't end up refining much in there, but I really like to paint what's in the light. I like to take those shapes, warp them, create a consistent form language by squishing it, reinterpreting it, keeping the same general base forms in there, but adding the symmetry and building out more of the design to make it feel a little more feasible. And I wanted it to feel rickety, not like it's polished, or that it's been spent all this time to make it look sexy or beautiful. I wanted it to feel very industrial. And you can see there for a second, I tried to add maybe some exoskeleton, maybe like drawing inspiration from insects, kind of a hard shell on the outside. But as soon as I did that, I felt like the mech lost some of its interesting tension it has in its legs. It's got this very, chicken walk. It feels very weak, almost like it could be pushed over and maybe it wouldn't survive that fall. And I thought that made it feel very deadly, very engaging, very just added tension to the whole design. Like, it looks cool, but do I really want to pilot that? It's probably unsafe, but I'd do it anyway. It looks fun. Here I'm re-emphasizing some of the values. I've keyed most of the painting to kind of keeping my values pretty restrained up till now. I brightened the sky, and the reason I keep it so restrained is I'm able to now really push things to the extremes, really start to get hotter highlights and darker darks. And the reason that that's important is if you start too white or if you start too bright and dark with too much contrast, it leaves you nowhere to go. The whole painting, you're just trying to control what you have there, but it's already overexposed and you're fighting already a losing battle. So the way I like to interpret it is keeping the values pretty in the middle and then building my materials, building my reflective lights on top of it. So you can see I'm going back to those soda cans one last time. This is the design I ended up with. I was a lot happier with it. Again, squishing those 3 lights to the bottom and kind of adding more cuts to the top part of it. I'll get into lights a little bit further into this video, but What they really add is they make it feel lived in, and this is where I tried to take it too far. Again, lights help it feel like things are activated, like they're on, like they're breathing, alive. I tried going for something where you see the brightness really coming off of each of these umbrellas, but as soon as I did, again, it lost that tension, it lost that rickety feel. It felt, now it was going for more of a utopian future. It was going for this place where everything's so bright and shiny, and that's not the look I really was excited about in this image. I was excited about the gritty, about the kind of torn down, a lot more metal, a lot more rust, a lot more beat up. So one thing, while I was adding these smoke clouds around the mech, I became super interested in the idea that this mech could express a really nice counter shape with how it's playing with light, counter change. And what that means is, you know, we have the main part of the mech, the lights are against dark, and so they pop off. You get this beautiful light on dark, but somewhere along the way you transition, and so I have the left leg be a dark on light. So now the leg is actually the darker object, and the distance behind it is bright. So having a really nice counter change transition there really helps it feel three-dimensional, and like lighting isn't only coming from one source. There's multiple light sources coming in, and how it's reacting to this mech is helping it feel more like a feasible space. Again, a lot of this video, what I wanted to do is talk about my thought process, because in the ImagineFX article, you guys will see kind of the successes of my painting, the parts where I achieved the things I wanted to. But in the video, you can really understand how many different options I tried and how many things went wrong. There I am again lighting that helicopter in the bottom right corner. It still didn't work. I added some lampposts for a little bit. It completely threw off the scale. So I'm trying a lot of things in this painting. A lot of them aren't working, but when I finally find the object that is working, I stick to it. And what I'm doing here is kind of creating 3 quick brands. I want an idea that, you know, when I think of a city, it's not all designed by one architect, like a theme park that's designed to be one way. When a cityscape, you have multiple architects building buildings at different times. You have them stacked next to each other. If you go to any mall, you'll just see tons of different storefronts, each with its own look. So I wanted to kind of create a brand that was really rectangular, really militaristic. You have a triangular one that maybe it's like evil, and then you have a circular one that maybe it's built more by the people. It's a little more friendly. So like the soda can buildings I was talking about, maybe that's something where the people actually use what's in there versus the rectangular buildings are something more militaristic. And you'll see me stick that rectangular logo as well onto the mechs. From here, pretty much everything is where I want it to be layout wise, and it's really just going through all the steps I've mentioned up to this point over and over until everything's working together. So I'm going through the lighting again, adding soft edges again, and then cutting it out with hard edges. I'm re-emphasizing the materials, re-emphasizing my contrast, using more lights to kind of create perspective. I think one of the best examples of that is the pink kind of billboard behind the mushroom or umbrella to the right. You kind of get an idea of how the space is going into the distance there. Want to add some smaller details to the mech's lighting so that it felt a little more detailed. This is the focal point. It's kind of my one chance that I get to noodle a little bit extra and just think about rendering. One of my favorite things to do is add, multiple colors of lights on each object, as well as have a painting have multiple colors. A lot of newer artists, when they attempt to do a colored painting, they will only have almost everything be gray, and then maybe just like red bars on it, or just one tone. It makes it feel very monochromatic, and that's really safe and a good place to start. But I wanted to challenge myself to, embrace color, embrace these greens, these reds, this color theory of how they're all interacting together. And I think when you do that, it'll actually make your paintings feel a lot more real, because again, it breaks that idea that only one artist designed everything. You want it to feel like there's moments of, you know, inspiration or randomness happening within the painting, just like in real life. Nothing is perfect and overly organized. I'm adding one giant umbrella mushroom to the far distance. I wanted to break some of the tangents that were happening in the image. There were so many vertical lines that it became really difficult to move through the image, because you just see all these vertical lines and your brain would get stuck on them. So by adding more of these kind of mushroom structures, it kind of added horizontals to break up some of their space. As well as same thing with that secondary light I just threw in there on the broken mech. Again, it really let me kind of come up with an excuse to create more contrast on my focal mech.